Welcome to Kitchen Table Finance.
Hey Dave, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Nick. How are you?
It's a beautiful Friday. Great day to be talking about retirement
Oh,
planning and finances. Couldn't
yeah,
ask for a better summer day in Michigan, right?
really? Well, um, it's pouring rain where I am.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah,
I thought that's
yeah.
the weather of your people, right?
Well, it is. I'm not complaining. I'm just, it's just not the perfect summer day by most people's definitions here.
Fair enough. Today's topic, Dave, is one that you and I spend a lot of time helping clients with, and that is how to plan on enjoying your retirement.
Yeah, everybody assumes we spend all kinds of time building spreadsheets and crunching numbers, but we end up having a lot of conversations about what are you actually going to do and how are you going to enjoy yourself.
Yeah, well, and we're, I'm sure if you've listened to enough of these podcasts, you've heard me use this analogy before. But when it comes to retirement planning, we kind of view it as putting together a jigsaw puzzle, right? And you've got
Hmm.
all of these different pieces that go into it, and those are the financial maneuvers that you can make. And the problem is, a lot of people start with trying to move the pieces around. And for us, the most important piece is the picture on the box.
Yeah.
And we really want to get to know what's important to you, why it's important to you, how you're going to enjoy retirement. And then we make financial decisions and move those pieces around based on, are we getting further or closer to this goal that you might have, right?
Yes, got to know where you're headed before you try to get there.
We say this a lot as well, but a lot of people spend so much time and energy saving for retirement, but they probably spend, a lot of them, it seems like less than an hour thinking about what they're actually going to do in retirement, what they want to do, and what that looks like. And I guess that's just the human fallibility, right?
Right.
So, as far as I kind of wanted to walk us through, we can have a conversation, Dave, around like how we set this up from the standpoint of like how to start thinking about this as you're thinking about retirement. And I think the first thing really comes down to like thinking through what your expectations for retirement are, because there's a lot of mainstream news media that wants you to believe that every retiree has a loving and adoring spouse, and they are usually on a sailboat somewhere, living, living.
A beach,
Yeah,
golf course, fishing has shown up a lot lately in retirement advertising.
yeah.
Um,
So it's all about kind of like this relaxation, easy life kind of thing. And what we find is that's not necessarily what a lot of people want. I mean, yes, I think that's a part of it, but for a lot of people, that only takes you so far, right? And so, if you're listening to this, you might be thinking, yeah, that sounds nice, but the thing about playing golf for most people, maybe this is just me because I'm not a very big golfer, but I like playing golf because it's a break from the work and I get to be outside and not really have any responsibilities. But
yeah,
when it stops becoming that, then it's a little bit different, right?
right, right. Yeah, I've always thought I'm going to be a lousy retiree because I haven't even owned golf clubs in 15
Yeah.
years now.
We want to really start by setting expectations, right? And the first thing that kind of comes to mind is work, right? So there are people that would prefer to have no work. We have clients that want maybe a downshift to some part-time work, and we have clients that will always work in some degree, shape, or fashion because they just can't stop, and that's kind of what drives them, and that's what's important to them, right?
Yeah, I kind of group, volunteering and other forms of engagement. You don't necessarily have to be compensated for it, or the compensation isn't necessarily the driving force behind it.
Yeah, that's a great point because we say work, but that doesn't necessarily have to be work for pay, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to slice up and think about what that might look like. But I think the main thing is, a lot of people believe that you got to work until you're 65 and then you stop working, and that's just not the reality. And so, like, if you haven't thought through like the what you get out of work and the important sides of it, it's a good time to kind of sit back and reflect on that and what that transition looks like.
For sure.
So, and it's one of those things too where it's like, how long have you been working, right? Like a lot of people started working when they were 13 in some cases, and a lot of them even started working full time when they were 18, right? And
Right.
now we're basically, you've worked for 40 years, right? You're in your mid 60s, and all of a sudden one day you're just going to stop completely, right? Like it's just such a drastic change. I think people don't
Yes.
realize it. And I kind of use the analogy of like, you wouldn't just start by running a mile every day and then one day you're just like, you know what I'm going to do, I'm going to run a marathon. Right?
Yeah.
Like you have to work up to that, right?
Yeah. 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 Ease into it and
Yeah.
have a plan.
Yeah. The other kind of expectation is, are you looking for an active lifestyle in retirement? Do you want a quiet lifestyle? What about travel? What about giving back? Like, those are some of the big expectations that a lot of our clients going through the retirement process start thinking about, because that also plays into like how you're gonna, put together the pieces of the puzzle, right?
Yeah. I would add in family
Yeah.
here too,
Hmm.
under this broad category. Think about like where, is it important to be near your grandkids? Is it important to be near your children? Is it important to be far away from your children?
Yeah.
Can go both
Yeah.
ways, I guess. Or is it important to be in a place where they're going to want to come visit you?
The last one is kind of like, what's your, are you looking for less stress? Are you looking for peace of mind? Or do you like the stress? Do you like the grind? And that kind of goes back to that work, not work kind of piece, right? Like some people are looking for a quiet, less stress, more peace of mind. And some people couldn't survive
Yeah.
if they had.
Well, and sometimes that's an interesting dynamic. Like I wouldn't mind working longer if it was less stressful.
Yeah. Right.
So there's some trade-offs there too, where maybe it's about finding ways to reduce stress but stay engaged in the workforce one way or another.
For sure. So the second part of this is kind of thinking through what your concerns are, right? And everybody kind of comes to retirement with some sort of different concerns, but these are kind of the top ones that we generally tend to see.
Yeah.
And the first one is kind of the one that I think almost everybody has, and that is running out of money, right?
Yeah,
Do
of
I have
course.
enough?
The number one question that drives people to our door is,
Yeah.
do I have enough to retire?
There's lots of different, ways that you can kind of figure that out and model that out. But it really, and it kind of goes in conjunction with what your expectations are, right? Like if you have grandiose expectations of travel and things like that, like, you probably need to do a lot more thinking about that running out of money question, where if you want to downshift and just live a quiet lifestyle, you might not be as far off as you think, right?
Right. You don't need as much money. Exactly.
The other top concern that we tend to see around here is healthcare costs and long-term care expenses.
Right.
One of the things that we do around here is, when it comes to planning, is we separate out those healthcare costs and try to kind of set some cost parameters around what we see, just in general terms of like, what are the averages, the costs of health insurance plus out-of-pocket expenses, and kind of moving those needles. And we generally like to separate them because the inflation on that has trended much higher than what general overall inflation has been.
Exactly. Hard to get away from talking about investment losses as a concern during retirement. It kind of goes hand in hand with running out of money, right?
Right, for sure.
Markets were always great. You didn't have to, you could just invest your money and be guaranteed a return, no problems.
Yeah, for sure. But that's always going to be kind of front and center of, in today's retirement, because we don't have the big pensions that we have seen in the past, because Social Security tends to be a piece of the puzzle, but not the overall puzzle, right? Then you kind of have self-funded, you have retirement accounts, but those that are dependent on the performance of the underlying investments. And so investment losses are potentially, higher on the concern list. And the next one we have here is health issues, and kind of dealing with that, right?
Yeah. And, like we said here a second ago, everybody comes to us worried about running out of money. But in my career and yours is almost as long as mine, and I bet you would echo this. Seeing clients struggle with health issues has been way more important than running out of money,
Yeah.
down the road.
Hmm. All of those people that have dealt with those health issues would give up any amount of money to have their health back, right?
Yeah, we've talked about this in the past. We've got a pretty good podcast from last summer about this time, I think, where we reviewed Outlive by Dr. Attia, but that's of primary importance.
Yeah, for sure. And just planning around that and thinking through what that entails, and we talked about a little bit in our housing conversation last week around like, making those housing decisions based on, what your health's going to be in the future and how that changes some of those dynamics. So it's definitely a concern. And then the last one is not having that consistent paycheck. And
Yeah.
I think because we've been doing this so long, we just assume everybody knows how to like recreate a paycheck, but it really is kind of one of those things that we just assume.
People struggle with that as they move into retirement, certainly. Like how do you turn this big blob of money into steady income? And we won't go into that in depth today, but I think the reason it is on this list under the concerns that impact people's happiness in retirement is that that's a real psychological concern. Yeah, we're talking about the technical side of turning a portfolio into income, and it's kind of not as big a deal as people think, but the psychological idea of not having a salary or a steady hourly job that you've had for 30 years, that's a different issue.
Yeah.
Knowing that you've got a check from your portfolio, or it's a different psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. People struggle with that concept. And the other thing that we see is they tend to be a lot of times a little bit more conservative than maybe they have to for fear of that, like, hey, I spent all this time growing this thing and now I got to turn it into income. And all of a sudden, those investment losses that they could just, roll off their back because it was a future problem,
Right.
it now problem.
Right. Well, and we see that in action every time there's a volatile period in the markets, and we talk to a client. Well, let's pull up my plan and see how am I going to have to go back to work? Am I going to have to cut this, that, or the other? Which the answer is almost invariably no, but or not because of the market maybe, but that is just such a prominent part of psychology and all of these things. If you don't address these concerns at least to some satisfaction, it's going to be hard to be happy in retirement.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're constantly stressed and worried about, where your portfolio is at and if it's going to hold up,
Yeah.
that it's going to take a drag on your ability to enjoy the money that you do have.
So you need to get it into a situation where it's not a psychological stressor.
So once you kind of understand like what your expectations are, what you want your retirement to look like, and you've kind of gone through the scenarios of what you're concerned about and address those things, then it's time to kind of put that all together with where you're at. And one of the things that we like to do going into retirement is look at the logical trade-offs and start thinking through like, we've prioritized all your goals and now let's look at what the dollars and cents of it means and start thinking through like, is this worth it or not worth it? One of the first ones that we always like to run, which is my favorite, is does working longer allow you to do more things on your list? Or like, what's that trade-off of, okay, if I worked an extra year, what does that mean in terms of here's the things that I want to do?
Yes. How much does it really change your potential income during retirement?
Yeah, yeah. And I think for a lot of people, it's always surprising in terms of like what that actual amount is
Yeah.
per year of extra work, right?
Yeah. It doesn't amount to nearly what most people expect it will.
Yeah, yeah. And so another interesting thing that kind of comes into play in these conversations too, which I always find fascinating, is like once we let people know that like what that difference is, and you probably be fine to retire tomorrow if you want to. A lot of them end up continuing to work and feel better about it because there's not that stress of like, hey, I can pick up and leave tomorrow, right?
Right.
Like I don't need this job.
Yeah. Yeah. The Johnny Paycheck syndrome. walk out when you want. It feels a little different going in.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. A whole different conversation. So, and that kind of goes back to that expectation of, no work, part-time work, always working, and what that looks like. The other kind of levers that you can look at is, can you retire now and be able to enjoy the top things on your list and maybe not some of the bottom ones, and having that internal conversation.
Yeah, with the trade-offs.
Yeah, what is the trade-off? Am I fine taking a $10,000 vacation a year, or do I need 20,000? And where does that mark? And is it worth working an extra year, kind of thing, right? And then the other thing too is, could you potentially save more money heading into retirement? Does that help move the needle? Does that help you or allow you to do more things in retirement? And we did a podcast episode, I think last year, on saving more money for retirement kind of helps on both ends because you can live on less, right?
Hmm.
But you also have more when it comes down to it. And so, looking through how that dynamic plays out and what that looks like. So once we kind of have that modeled out, we look at those different strategies and you make that decision of, this kind of looks like what makes the most sense for me. I like the idea of, make a plan and start practicing it, right?
Yeah, try it out.
And it goes back to this whole thing of, you've been working your whole life. The longest vacation that you took is probably a week or two if you've been,
Hmm.
healthy and lucky enough not to have some sort of major health crisis. And so maybe it's time to work with your employer or figure out like what happens if I take a month off.
Yeah, see how it feels.
So we love the idea of mini retirements and just thinking through like, how do I practice this and make sure that I like it? Whether that's traveling south in the winter and seeing if you enjoy it or not, right?
Yeah,
Got some experience there, Dave?
got some experience there. My wife and I were fortunate enough to be able to spend a good chunk of this winter working remotely, and while it wasn't true retirement, we were still working. It gave us a feel for what it was like to be snowbirds, and learned a lot about what we liked and what we didn't like about that experience and how we would do it different next time. And I was glad to be able to do it in a low stakes way like that.
And so just little things like that, like even you when you were working still, like to have that ability to, see what that feels like, I think is important. The other one is start volunteering for something that you love, right? Like if you want to have that work, but you don't necessarily
Right.
need to get paid, it's probably a good idea to put some feelers out.
See if just doing something like that fills the I don't want to say void. You know what I mean? Scratches the
Yeah.
itch anyway
Yeah.
that
Hmm.
work does for you in a way that maybe is not stressful and more fulfilling because you're working on something you really care about.
The other one I had down was spend more time with family, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
everybody potentially wants to spend more time with family, but when you actually do it,
You can have too much of a good thing.
yeah, maybe you figure out that, a week is enough time. I don't need to go and live with the kids for a whole month.
Yeah. And kind of a subset of this, other than vacations, a lot of us haven't spent, long amounts of time with not a lot to do with our spouse.
Yeah, right.
Our founding partner Beth used to insist that when she was working with couples that they not try to retire at the same time,
Yeah.
for that very reason. But get some, see what it's like to be together all the time.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a great point. And, everybody, if you're, hey, we're not raising isn't the right word, but babysitting your grandkids is a big thing that you want to potentially be able to do. You probably ought to try that out for a week.
Make sure your relationship with them is going to survive that and be better for it instead of worse, because it could go either way for some people. Sure.
Yeah. And the other one I have down here, we've had clients that have jumped into this too, but it seems like, renting an RV and traveling around as opposed to just buying one and like try it out first a little bit, I think is good advice from the people that we've known.
Yeah. In place of RV, you could plug in condo,
Yeah.
apartment,
Yeah. Hmm.
house, try different places, try different things. I think it's an American road trip kind of psychology that, hey, when I retire, I don't care. I'll just live out of my car, or, I'm going to
Yeah.
drive Route 66 or whatever. And it sounds great when you're, in your cubicle and everything's, dreary. But is that really going to make you happy when you get out there? Maybe for a couple weeks, but you better know before you do it.
right before you jump in, full fledged. Um, and there's a lot of easy ways to potentially be able to do those kinds of things where it's not like high stakes of I'm going to spend 100 grand on a motorhome.
Everything's a trade-off, but I'd a lot rather do a 6-week Airbnb rental that maybe costs me more than it would if I put a year-long lease on something, but know that that's where I want to be. Or, and the extreme version is do that, before I put a down payment on a house that then 2 years later I'm just wondering why we're in this neighborhood or why we chose this town. Yeah,
And then the last point here, I think, is also important, and that is be prepared to change your plan.
yeah, always.
And it kind of goes back to this idea of we don't spend enough time thinking about what we want, and we certainly don't spend enough time practicing to make sure that we like it. So I guess the point is we shouldn't be surprised if we don't want to do it after all, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of people will do something for a certain amount of time and they scratch the itch and they go, "Oh, that's enough. I don't need to do it more," right?
Yes. Yeah.
And what we don't want people to do is get stuck into the trap of I said I was going to do this, so now I'm going to do it even though I'm miserable, right?
Right. Yes, think about it. Think about what you really want to do, but just be ready for, regardless of how it may be the great right decision for this year and next year, it may not feel right 3 or 4 years from now.
Yeah,
So, we always try to bake in that flexibility. We've both seen it. Nobody's plan stays the same. Everybody starts out like the typical retiree or pre-retiree that we're working with, right? We've got healthcare expenses built into their plan. We've got basic living expenses, and then 9 times out of 10, travel.
yep,
That's usually it, right?
yeah,
I mean, that
yeah,
like everything that they want, and we just kind of know that travel bucket. We really should just call it discretionary stuff we haven't really thought about yet,
right,
because it changes every year. It morphs a little bit. The spending amount I find stays pretty much on the
yeah,
rails. But this year it might be a cottage up north that the grandkids come spend time with you. Next year it might be a trip to Italy.
right.
We never know, and we just kind of have to be ready to roll.
Well, and retirement is such a long time frame, and you've
Yeah.
said this quite a bit too, Dave. Where we're just not programmed as humans to understand what we're going to want, need in
Yeah.
a long
Yeah.
when you're looking out 10, 15, 20 years, right? We just have no concept of that.
Right, right. What's fun today may not be fun then. And it may not be health related. It may just be that you've done what you wanted to do with that particular hobby or that thing.
Yeah. And so one of the things that we're always doing in our plan is building in that flexibility of like we don't draw this plan around, okay, you said you're going to travel and so now that's what you have to do and you're stuck. We designed your entire plan around it and we can't pivot or do something else or look at it differently, right? So having that flexibility is super important. And it's honestly it's stranger when people do stick to their plan than when they don't, right?
Yes.
Like that's more outside of the norm.
That'd be the shocker. I think all of this just comes down to be as intentional as you can, think things through as much as you can, and that will all feed into enjoying your retirement.
Well, with that, if our listeners have any questions, feel free to shoot us an email at info@srbadvisors.com. Or if you have your own story about how retirement went well or didn't go well for you, we'd love to hear those as well. As always, Dave, it has been a pleasure.
It's been fun, Nick. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you for joining us for another chat about your retirement and finances. Please hit that subscribe button. You can also contact us at srbadvisors.com or email us at info@srbadvisors.com. See you next time on Kitchen Table Finance.
This is a Zedia Media production.